We are going to change this country. Believe you me. Hii nchi tutaibadilisha. We have what it takes as a nation. There is no reason why we cannot catch up with Singapore, Malaysia, South Korea. There is no reason we can catch up with them if we just make the right decisions. And I'm going to go out of my way to make sure we make those decisions. I'm going to provide the leadership.
President Ruto loves talking about Singapore, and I mean loves it. If you turned his Singapore references into a drinking game, you'd need a liver transplant by the end of any campaign season. But here's the thing about invoking Singapore. When you compare yourself to Lee Kuan Yew's legacy, you're not just making a promise, you're inviting a comparison. And today, we're going to accept that invitation. Because if Ruto wants to be Kenya's Lee Kuan Yew, we need to ask, what did Lee Kuan Yew actually do? What were his convictions, his track record, and how does that stack up to our guy? Lee Kuan Yew took power in 1959 in a Singapore that was, by his own admission, a mosquito-infested swamp. But here's what mattered about Lee. The man had convictions that bordered on obsession. Conviction number one, meritocracy above everything. Lee famously said, "I am often accused of interfering in the private lives of citizens. Yes, if I did not, had I not done that, we wouldn't be here today." He meant it. Singapore's civil service became legendarily clean through one simple principle: pay bureaucrats well, hold them to impossible standards, and if they are corrupt, and I cannot stress this enough, destroy them. When his own minister was caught in a corruption scandal in 1986, Lee didn't defend him. Didn't create a commission that would report in 5 years. The man was prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned. Lee's childhood friend, gone. Conviction number two, long-term planning over short-term popularity. In 1965, when Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia, Lee cried on national television. Wink, wink, like our current president has cried before on public television. But he didn't wallow. He had a 10-year plan, then a 20-year plan, then a 50-year plan. When his advisors said Singaporeans wouldn't accept rooftop water catchment systems, he made them mandatory anyway. When people complained about the speaking of Mandarin campaign affecting their dialects, he pushed forwards. Popular? No. Necessary for his vision? Absolutely important. Conviction number three, corruption is existential. Lee treated corruption like a cancer. His approach was surgical and brutal. Singapore's CPIB, the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, reported directly to the Prime Minister. It had powers that would make Kenya's EACC look like a school debate club. Between 1960 and 1970, Singapore prosecuted over 200 public officials. Not sent them home to retire peacefully, I mean prosecuted them. Some went to jail actually. Now, let's talk about our President William Samoei Ruto's convictions. Conviction number one, survival. Look, I'll give Ruto credit. The man is a political survivor of the highest order. From YK92 to the 2007 post-election violence, to the ICC case, to deputy president, to now president. This is someone who knows how to read a room and get out alive. But here's the problem. Surviving is not the same as building. Lee Kuan Yew built institutions that outlasted him. Ruto has built what exactly? Alliances? Sure. But institutions? Conviction number two, the story matters more than the substance. Ruto is a masterful storyteller. The hustler narrative, brilliant politics. The wheelbarrow spin symbolism, chef's kiss. The chicken seller who became president, My God, inspiring. But when we fact-checked his Jamhuri Day speech in one of our previous episodes, remember what we found? The Hustler Fund he loves touting has a default rate so high that if it were a student, it would have been expelled. Affordable housing units that exist more in PowerPoint than actually in Pangani. Lee Kuan Yew didn't need to sell Singapore's transformation. You could see it is in the skyline, measure it in the GDP, feel it in the infrastructure. Conviction number 3, loyalty over competence. And here is where it gets interesting. Ruto's cabinet appointments tell you everything about his convictions. When corruption scandals hit his administration, and they have repeatedly, what happens? Reshuffles. Reassignments, the political equivalent of moving deck chairs on the Titanic. Lee Kuan Yew fired his friends. Ruto recycles his allies. Now let's look at the receipts. In 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita was about $500. By 1990, when Lee Kuan Yew stepped down as Prime Minister, it was at $12,000. That's a 24 times growth in 25 years. But more importantly, and this is what Ruto always forgets to mention, here's how Lee did it. Infrastructure. Lee didn't just promise ports and airports. By 1972, Singapore had become one of the world's busiest ports. Not we are planning to build, he actually built. In education, in 1959, 50% of the Singaporeans were illiterate. By 1980, primary education was universal and literacy rates were above 90%. They didn't just build schools, they created a system that actually worked for all the Singaporeans. Housing. Don't get even started. The Housing Development Board built 450,000 apartments by 1985. Not affordable housing units, by the way. Actual homes with title deeds. Anti-corruption. Singapore went from Transparency International ranking of highly corrupt in the 1960s to consistently top 5 least corrupt countries globally. They didn't just talk about fighting corruption, they actually fought it tooth and nail. Now, Ruto has been president since 2022, so it's not entirely fair to compare 3 decades of Lee Kuan Yew to 3 years of Ruto. But let's look at what we have. Number 1, the Hustler Fund, launched with massive fanfare. Defaults are through the roof. The fund that was supposed to revolutionize access to credit has become a case study in how not to do financial inclusion. Affordable housing. Bold promise, groundbreaking ceremonies. But ask yourself, do you know anyone who actually moved into one of these affordable houses? Anyone. And I mean personally. Infrastructure, roads. Some are being built, yes, but remember when Ruto said he'd fix all the roads? Then remember when the roads budget got slashed? That's the difference between promising and delivering. Anti-corruption. This is where it gets painful. The Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission exists. Cases get filed. And then silence. Or even worse, the accused get promoted. And some are even released from prison even after the fact they had been found guilty. And they even go ahead and sue the government for punitive damages. When Ruto talks about fighting corruption, compare it to Lee Kuan Yew prosecuting his childhood friend. Can you imagine Ruto doing that to any of his political allies? Me neither. I can't. Here's what what makes the Singapore comparison so insulting to anyone who studied history. Lee Kuan Yew's promises were boring. He didn't promise to transform Singapore overnight. He promised 10 years of hard work, 20 years of sacrifice. He told people their lives would get harder before they got better. And this is the most crucial part, he actually did the boring work. Ruto's promises are exciting. Bottom-up economics, digital superhighway, affordable housing for all, Kenya Kwanza, the hustler nation will rise. But when you check the receipts, the Hustler Fund defaults, affordable housing units that exist mainly in speeches, the digital superhighway that's mostly full of potholes. Lee Kuan Yew said, I'm not saying that everything I did was right, but everything I did was for an honorable purpose. You might disagree with Lee's methods, and many do. He was an authoritarian. He suppressed dissent. He controlled media, but you cannot question whether he built Singapore. Ruto says, we will make Kenya the Singapore of Africa. And I want to ask, how? With what convictions? What are you feeling? What are you willing to sacrifice? Which of your friends are you willing to prosecute? What long-term plans are you following that doesn't change based on the next election cycle? Because when I think about it, 5 years or 3 years back, when we gave him the mandate to be the president of the Republic of Kenya, he came on board with the hustler mentality. The narrative then wasn't to make Kenya the next Singapore of Africa. The then narrative was it's hustlers versus dynasties. It was an opportunity to create a bottom-up economy where you empower the poor mama mboga, the charcoal seller, because he was one of them at one point. The chicken seller that became president. So he identified with the hustler. But all of a sudden, 3 years in, the narration has changed. Now it's no longer about creating the bottom-up economy. Now, he wants to make us the Singapore of Africa. And here's the core difference, and it's uncomfortable. Lee Kuan Yew built systems bigger than himself. Singapore's success didn't end when he stepped down as PM in 1990. The institutions he created, the CPIB, the civil service, the educational system, the housing board, they worked without him. That's the definition of institution building. Ruto is building a political machine centered on himself, unfortunately. And look, every politician does this to some extent. But when your anti-corruption efforts depend on your personal intervention, when your projects only move when you're personally involved, when your government's credibility rises and falls with your approval ratings, you are not building Singapore. You're building a personality cult. No different from profit or war. The Singapore model required brutal honesty about problems. Secondly, long-term thinking, 20 to 50-year plans, meritocracy even when it's politically costly, prosecuting allies when they are corrupt, accepting short-term unpopularity for long-term gain. The Ruto model offers? What does the Ruto model offer? Optimistic promises about transformation, short-term political calculations, loyalty-based appointments, recycling of allies despite corruption allegation, prioritizing popularity and narrative control. These are not the same thing. Not even a bit. When President Ruto says Kenya will become the Singapore of Africa, he's not wrong. That is possible. Kenya has incredible human capital, natural resources, strategic location, and entrepreneurial energy that Singapore could only dream of in 1965. But here's what we need to understand. Singapore didn't happen because Lee Kuan Yew gave good speeches about becoming Switzerland of Asia. It happened because he built systems, prosecuted the corrupt, planned for decades, and was willing to be unpopular in service of a long-term vision. If Ruto wants to be Kenya's Lee Kuan Yew, we need to see his friends going to jail for corruption and not getting reshuffled. A 20-year infrastructure plan that outlasts his presidency. Meritocratic appointments even when they are politically costly. Institutions that work whether he's watching or not. Hard truths delivered to Kenyans, not just aspirational rhetoric. Until then, and I mean until then, invoking Singapore isn't inspiration. It's an insult. An insult to Lee Kuan Yew's legacy, to Singapore's transformation, and to Kenyans who deserve better than empty promises wrapped in borrowed glory. The Singapore model worked, but you cannot cherry-pick the success while ignoring the sacrifice, the systems, and the brutal honesty it required. So, President Ruto, Your Excellency, if you're all listening, Singapore isn't a speech. It's a commitment. Show us you're ready to make it. Don't just give us good narratives and rhetoric. And as always, receipts over vibes. I'm your host, DY, and this has been the Kenyan week that was. See you next week or next time. It's been a lovely time having you guys here. Baraka tele. Have a lovely evening, day, or night, wherever you are. I'm your host again, DY.